So this is us transmitting the window. I think we are okay now. I think we are transmitting to the internet right now. So welcome everybody. Thank you, Sylvia, for this opportunity. And I'll just like to make a really brief introduction on why we are doing this. There has been an ongoing discussion in our graduate course to address the issue of how our graduate students can have a career in the private sector and not only restricted to employment in academia. However, in order to do that, we need to give some of our students this training. And Professor Silvia Gutmozin, who is the graduate course coordinator, now actually presented some really interesting idea in our last encounter, a graduate course encounter, in which she showed what we needed to do in order to show to our students that how to be an entrepreneur, how to actually work in the private sector, to start their own startups, and that is a real possibility. So I would definitely say that if you distinguish the terms adventure from venture, although they are very similar nouns, adventure is the desire or things that happen without design or chance that brings us very close to a chance of danger or loss or hazard. But venture is a planned undertaking of an adventure. And I would definitely say that this planned undertaking of an adventure is quite interesting if you have the proper knowledge, if you have the proper academic formation to actually endeavor in those lines. So in that sense, the problems that really hit our world right now and that need smart people, intelligent people to actually know how to tackle those problems and change those problems. I would definitely say that it's misleading to say that graduate students or scientists have no place on ventures. And so, which means to say that we should be motivating these students to be entrepreneurs. And we should be motivating these students to actually do something about it. And I would like to say that Senan, we met in Senan Ebrahim, is an MD, PhD. We have, while he was pursuing his PhD in Harvard, he did this in Harvard Computational Neuroscience in Massachusetts General Hospital. We work with machine learning techniques, approaches for seizure prediction and epilepsy. But he also is an incredible entrepreneur. He's a person that takes action against what he thinks are the big problems of humanity, and he actually does something about it. So he opened up, and I think one incredible company that he actually founded or co-founded and was Hikma Health. And this company allowed patients to be screened for COVID, especially patients in refugee camps. So he helped a lot of Syrian refugee camp patients to actually use a specific app, a software that would allow them to screen and actually help with the treatment of COVID symptoms. Hikma Health won the 2019 New Venture competition in Harvard Business School competition. And CEO right now, and Senan right now is also the CEO of Delfina and co-founder of Delfina. So he actually has his MD degree, he has a PhD degree, but is very much emerged into this idea of building companies that can help other people and help world problems in a way that probably by working in an office alone, he couldn't have that big of a reach. So it's really a great honor and pleasure to have Senan. Thank you very much for accepting this this invitation to give this lecture, and I'll leave you to it. So thank you very much, Senan, for accepting. This is very good for our graduate course, and I hope our students enjoy this.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Moraes, and thank you, Professor Guachimasin, for graciously having me, and Professor Felipe and Professor Verano. I'm really excited to share with you all, with the students. My story is about, I had a very unique journey to arrive to where I am, and I'm just happy to share another data point that can help you all consider potential career options. That, for me, it definitely made me. It definitely took me on a different path than what I had expected when I first went into my MD PhD. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. So just going to share with you a little bit today. First, we're just going to chat for about 10-15 minutes. I'll just share with you my story, but what I'm really interested in, especially based on my last experience in Brazil. Unfortunately, we're not going to have any churrasco today together, but one day, hopefully again soon. I'm really interested in hearing your perspectives and actually having an exchange of ideas, fielding any questions, and hearing any of your thoughts and ideas, especially as pertains to potential entrepreneurship ventures. Would love to just have more of a discussion today. So I did get to know Professor Moraes back in 2016-17 when I was doing my PhD in Mass General Hospital on seizure detection and prediction. And he taught me a lot of what I knew scientifically. I learned about how you can actually take physiologic time series data and make sense of it using this cool new machine learning approach. I also learned from him when I visited here how to run a group. I was very, when we were in MGH, which, a group that I know Vinicius and others know, with Professor Cash's group, we had a particular lab culture, we had a particular focus. But when I came to visit your lab here at UFMG, I was very impressed by a lot of the ingenuity that I saw, a lot of the innovative techniques. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and I saw a lot of rigging basically electronics together, coming up with new surgical approaches that none of us had done before. So I just want to say, I think this is definitely a two-way learning street. I've already learned a lot from you all, and I hope that we can keep that going today. And the other folks pictured here, I'm sure many of you know, Professor Grace Canata Pereira and Professor Tasso Moraes, Marcia's father. And this is my brother, Ali, who will factor in later in the story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I started Hikma Health, the nonprofit company that Marcio mentioned. When I was in, this was right around 2017, in the middle of my PhD, my family is actually from Syria, and my grandmother was living in Damascus and was displaced by the war. So that really motivated me to look at ways to potentially try to help in the Syrian conflict. And being not yet a fully trained physician, I was pretty limited in that respect. I was pretty financially limited. So there were not too many things I could do immediately. But my brother and I, we entered the MIT Refugee Learning Accelerator at the MIT Media Lab, which was a great environment to just start testing out ideas, and kind of a sandbox environment. Gave us a little bit of support and a lot of mentorship. And a couple other folks from our network, Maurice from the lab and others, joined in to try to come up with software technologies that may help populations around the world. And while we were there, while we were actually as part of this program, we worked on software solutions for about 3 months. And then in the winter, in January, they took us to Jordan to actually meet with refugee patients, to meet with their physicians, to meet with their educators, and then to actually think with them about solutions that would really be helpful on the ground. So while I was there, I heard the story of Hisham al-Abrash, who was a 8-year-old Syrian refugee boy who had type 1 diabetes. But when he got to the refugee camp, that record was lost, that information was lost. With the level of health literacy in that population, he certainly didn't know, his parents didn't know. So he kept having basically hyperglycemic events, which the doctors misinterpreted as murashah, which in Arabic just means you have kind of a cold. And they kept just telling him to go home. Well, unfortunately, literally a few weeks later, he ends up in a Jordanian emergency room in a diabetic ketoacidotic crisis. Thankfully, in his case, they were able to bring him back, but it was too close for comfort. And there's thousands of other kids like Hisham who do not get the care that they need and deserve because the doctors at the point of care don't know their entire medical story. So hearing that story, which has since been publicly shared in the New York Times, it really moved me and Hassan, who is my brother, to found an organization to say, look, we can actually solve this problem. We can create very cheaply a free and open source offline first EHR, electronic health record system, that'll work for patients like Hisham. So that's exactly what we set out to do. And I think I was well situated being at MGH, but more generally being in a lab environment where I think as a scientist, you're taught to distill basically you go to the refugee camp and it's a mess, right? There's so many needs, even within designing an EHR system, there's so many competing factors and influences. But we learn what's aim 1, 2, and 3, right? What are the key factors in this pathophysiologic flow that are linchpins that I got to make sure I nail. So that sort of thinking was actually not too far from the product-based thinking, which I learned at Hikma Health, which is distilling again the key feature requirements. What is it that would allow Dr. Firas, who's a heroic physician working in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, what do I need to do to this software to make it something that he can use? And looking at the existing solutions that were available for him was a very illuminating way to do that. And we identified 3 main problems. One was that the workflows were just completely off. They took way too long. They prioritized billing rather than outcomes. So in the US, our entire health record system is probably less of a problem with some Brazilian systems. But for us, right, with insurance and all the complexities of reimbursement, when doctors are taking notes about us, it's mostly so that they can get paid later. It's not really optimally oriented around our care. And that's only just starting to change now in the US. But in 2016, 17, it was not, it was really, the incentives were really misaligned. And then the last thing was, a lot of the medical practice was actually happening in vans in the Bekaa Valley, which looks something like Ouro Preto in terms of how remote and mountainous. And, if you just go outside at a place far from an internet cafe, there's just not going to be good connectivity. So if you're parking your mobile van clinic in some mountain, you got to have a system that's provisioned offline first. So at the end of the day, I realized we were in grad school at the time. We didn't have a lot of resources. We were spending most of our time in the lab. But even as a part-time endeavor, we were able to launch Hikma Health as a successful 501c3, which is our US code for nonprofit. And we were able to actually build a real software system, which any of you all can download from our Hikma Health GitHub. And it's agile, it's cloud-based, but offline provisioned, and it's easy to integrate with any system that you may already have. So this product, which we're very proud to share freely with the world, was basically the product of mostly volunteers. We did at one point pay several professional engineers to contribute in different ways. But, I was able to basically manage a lot of this project on a part-time basis when I was in grad school. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to do that because, one, I was able to actually make an impact. As Professor Marias was saying, there's not a lot of ways, especially as a grad student in basic science, you're doing some work on epilepsy research, which you hope one day might make its way into an algorithm for a neurostimulatory device or into an algorithm that may be used in the epilepsy monitoring unit. But the reality is the probabilities are low and the scale of impact and timeline of impact are always limited because the incentives are off again, right? In that space, you're incentivized to try to let's send this to nature. That's really the goal in a lot of scientific research environments. And to Professor Sidney Cash, his credit, the lab that Professor Marias and I met in, that was not so much the emphasis as much as it was doing foundational science and really a culture of exploration and discovery. And that's unfortunately, I think, very rare in a lot of scientific environments these days, with the pressure to get grant money, with the pressure for publication, which I understand is very universal. And those are good things because we obviously need money to fund our enterprise and we need publications to share that knowledge and those learnings with the world. But at the end of the day, if we are not actually able to pursue the questions that we're genuinely motivated by and that make a real impact on the world, then what are we even doing? So I found Hikma Health as a great avenue to explore entrepreneurship, in this case, social entrepreneurship. So I didn't learn too much about, budgets and cap tables and how to get venture funding, because this was really, as Professor Marias mentioned, we did win venture competitions, which gave us equity free funding. And we got grants and donations from a lot of folks. But at the end of the day, it was still a very different introduction and a very soft introduction to entrepreneurship. If you're interested in what we do at Hikma Health, you can also check us out at hikmahealth.org, where we continue to serve folks actually not just in Lebanon, which is where we started, but also now in Nicaragua, where there are many migrant patients, and we're serving tens of thousands of them through our partnerships with clinics over there through our health record system. So now I'm going to share with you what I'm doing now in life, which is the second company, Delphina, and how it relates to my PhD work. So when I was actually on my PhD, I was already thinking about different kinds of, we worked primarily with EEG data, which I know many of you probably do as well, being in the neurosciences. But the reality is, we were already talking about a lot of different modalities of physiologic monitoring and recording. I remember actually Professor Morais teaching me how to make EKG leads to potentially sample, cardiac signals and see if those were in any way predictive or at least detective of ictal activity, of seizure activity. So, that foundation was already well laid early in grad school, where I was thinking about different signals that emanate from the human body and the different biomarkers that both might lie in there that a physician could pick up, but also more crucially, a machine learning algorithm might be able to pick up that we might not even see by the human eye. So I was already kind of thinking in that sense since grad school days. I did various random collaborations with professors at MIT that were doing all kinds of different signal acquisition using new wireless sensors and all kinds of different hardware modalities. So it was already top of mind. Then I go back to my med school curriculum. I go back to my med school rotations, and I just see a different world where in clinical practice, we're not using any of these cutting edge wireless sensors that, the MIT groups were implementing. We're still using fetal monitoring systems from the 1970s and 80s. The core technology, both in terms of sensing, in terms of signal processing, and then most importantly for me on the analytics side, hadn't changed. And to tragic effect, when I was on my OB-GYN rotation on the labor and delivery wards, we do a week where we work nights. And one night, this woman came in because she felt her baby stop kicking. And unfortunately, when we put it on the monitor, it was not exactly clear what was happening. Maybe the leads were misplaced. And it took a little while for the attending physician to actually come in and read the strip that was being printed from a fax machine looking device in the corner. And very sadly, by the time the physician came to read that, her baby had already passed. It was no longer viable. So witnessing that very tragic event, that stillbirth, motivated me to look into this space and see if there was a way that while this physician was off in a different OR delivering, we might be able to use a machine learning based system to throw an alarm that's highly specific and sensitive to say, this baby is at hypoxic risk. We need to intervene now. And, in this space, just like I saw in the EEG space, there were really poor inter-rater agreements between professionals who had been trained for years on how to read these fetal heart signals. And, we're talking about like in the 40% range. So theoretically, even a rules-based approach would be a significant improvement. But the scale of the problem was also massive. I happened to see this one stillbirth, but around the world, there's 130 million babies born every year, of which 4 million are going to have some kind of hypoxia-related birth injury, and 1.7 million of whom will pass, just like the baby I saw. And as you heard from my story, fetal heart monitoring is actually the bottleneck where a trained obstetrician needs to be there in 10 places at once, or looking at 10 different things at once to make crucial life-saving decisions about 10 different or potentially even 20 different laboring moms. So we're at a really unique time too, and this is something I want to share with you because I think in the lab there tends to be a little bit of an insular approach or insular culture. And even if you're in a more free-thinking lab that doesn't, participate in the scientific groupthink that can be too common, there's just a sense of, okay, this is what we do. This is our wheelhouse. This is our workshop. We do EEG. We do EKG, or we only do signal processing in this particular way. So I think outside the box thinking is not always rewarded in science. Conformity can be enforced in different ways, particularly through funding. That's one of the main ways in which, a lot of brilliant scientists have been sidelined historically. But fortunately for you all, at least in Professor Myas's lab, and I imagine in sort of the academic culture in your space, it's actually quite entrepreneurial in that you all are attuned to the headwinds and the tailwinds of what's happening in society, right? What's happening with COVID, what's happening with the Brazilian vaccination response. All of that matters because that's going to change the potential impact of the science that you're doing. And if you choose to pursue an entrepreneurial career or not, there are many avenues to impact, but only if you really truly understand how your enterprise and your project and your research is situated within the global context and society, which, as we all know, is rapidly evolving. So for us in this this prenatal care monitoring space, there were some really interesting trends that we saw happening. First and foremost was patients finally being empowered after years of very patriarchal practice kind of throughout the medical profession, but really especially in OB-GYN. Finally, the practice had begun to change, the leadership had begun to change, and most importantly, the patients had started demanding empowerment. They want to be part of their own care. They want to be the leader in the decision-making process as they should be. And that sort of revolution in perspective has already started to sweep through obstetrics. Secondly, and most relevantly for us, the scientific capabilities were just democratized, right? By the time I started my PhD, there was Keras, there was TensorFlow, these technologies that, just a few years before in, let's say, 2010, 2012 were inaccessible. In 2015, 16 had been so commoditized that I, by myself, working a Python notebook, could spin up a high performing model if I knew how to featureize. So that scientific capability piece just unlocked, and a lot of credit to the companies and organizations that open sourced a lot of this before, because they really made all of our work and a lot of this next generation of companies work possible. And finally, the most crucial factor for us is that with Delphina, we are aiming to deliver a service that's essentially now going to be partially remote. And with the tailwind of the pandemic, finally obstetricians started to change their own perspective and their own culture. Instead of demanding that pregnant women come to the office 16 times during the average pregnancy, which never ends up happening, they started investigating possible technologies. That's telehealth, that's remote monitoring, things that Delphina does because patients needed it during the pandemic. And even looking beyond the hopeful one day, the end of the pandemic, the patients will continue to demand it. So in this setting, in this unique milieu of factors, enters Delphina. And what we've actually done already is built a product that is a fetal monitoring system that can automate risk stratification, basically by a very similar system to the one that I investigated in my PhD for EEG, where we looked at, from the ICU, what different EEG patterns were labeled as by various experts, and used a clustering approach to reconcile that. So you'll see kind of throughout Delphina, while the science is very different, right? It's not really hinging on any of the very deep technical work that we did on seizure prediction or seizure detection, because it's a different space. A lot of the approaches and themes are common. And a lot of the use case is also common, where you're going to alert physicians to a high-risk pattern just as you would if there was a patient in the epilepsy monitoring unit. So you'll see that as I devised the product for Delphina and also now the market launch for it, a lot of the early lessons I learned in grad school from talking to epileptologists, it seemed like a very parallel problem that, even though I didn't have any scientific expertise in until after I finished my PhD, until after 2019, I was able to relatively quickly understand the space given the parallels. So that was something I want to encourage you all to do, to look, potentially beyond the particular neurorecording modality that you're using, or even potentially beyond EEG, or for those of you in the molecular side, to look beyond the particular molecular pathways that you study today, or the particular cell types or organ systems you study today. And there's many examples of companies that have basically sprung from folks that, believe it or not, may have no biology background whatsoever, or no engineering background whatsoever, or more commonly, folks from a parallel subdomain that found a really interesting and ripe space for collaboration. And basically you can see here what our system looks like. And I just wanted to share it with you because I love tinkering on a product. I actually, one of the first things we did in grad school, Professor Morais taught me how to build a GUI. And that was definitely, it unlocked a lot of our expertise in the lab. So folks like Professor Cash could theoretically, all of their knowledge on what an EEG trace looks like, they could then share back with our system. So thinking about the future of what this obstetrics system will look like, as well as more generally in medicine, like thinking about what in 2030 medicine might look like, I really believe it's going to be a hybrid system. There's going to be clinicians that are always going to be the front line of care because they're the best at, of course, communicating with the patient, but also most importantly, reading signals from the patient. And those are human signals, things they'll tease out during history taking, observations that they'll make during a exam that's not going to be replaced by computer vision anytime soon. But what machine learning is excelling at now is that once that data is structured and ingested, machine learning systems can render really specific insights. They can actually spin out, risk prediction scores that are highly valid. And within a very tight confidence interval, you can know, okay, for Mrs. Smith, she's going to have an 80% risk of hypoxic injury for her baby in the next 2 minutes. That's the power of machine learning, which is only now starting to be harnessed by both hospital systems and entrepreneurial initiatives like ours at Delphina. So the last thing I want to share is that no one takes this journey alone. This is the founding team here for Delphina. And I'm very fortunate that my brother, Ali, who you saw earlier, who visited Beaga with me in 2018, at that time, he was actually a Google engineer visiting the Google office there, and he was a technical lead in the machine learning space. So he has a lot of experience taking the work that we all do as scientists in Python notebooks and deploying it at scale and talking about tens of millions of queries, which was the work that he did at Google. And I'm really lucky that he's my brother, but also he actually brings a deep scientific perspective himself, as he did his PhD in bioengineering at UCSD. And I think he saw a lot of parallels to me, where when we told our respective mentors that this is what we wanted to do, in my case to start Delphina, and in his case to go work in industry as a Google machine learning engineer, we both faced, Sid was Professor Cash, he was very supportive. But at the end of the day, it's not a typical path. It's becoming more common, but there's sort of a big question of, okay, if this fails, or if you don't get what you want out of it, will you be able to come back to academia? And that's an open question. Not a lot of people have successfully made the jump both ways, but in past generations, a lot of people were even trying. So I do love a lot of things about academic research, and I miss some components of it. I miss the time scale in a way, because even though sometimes it's frustrating that things don't change month over month, it's really cool to sometimes just do a deep dive into a new topic and learn it and try to master it. And sometimes now in the fast-paced product-oriented world at Delphina, even while we do a lot of our own research, it's a much more focused R&D effort, and we often have to really put blinders on and focus on the problem at hand and worry about the more far-fetched, really cool ideas later on down the line. So Ali and I have definitely had an adjustment in that way. And I also want to share, what has been amazing about Delphina and what I've really enjoyed is that, I have learned a ton from Priyanka, who is our head of product, who has 15 years of experience. Actually, she also comes from the EEG world at a company called Emotive, where, they're known for basically having companies like a perfume company will put an EEG headset on a bunch of folks and they'll see what the olfactory response is like on an EEG readout, and then pick the best perfume. So they basically have like a cognitive and like a readout basically for products based on folks' EEG response. And she led product over there and at several companies before. So having her on board, really changed the ethos and dynamic of our company. And we've learned a ton about how to really think in a product focused way. And then of course, Dr. Eliza Nguyen, who's my wife, who also at one point visited with us. She is currently in her obstetrics residency at Mayo Clinic, but she actually co-founded the company, very much sort of a around the dinner table type co-founding situation with my brother and my wife. But she brought a lot of the key clinical insights and said, she and I worked on the early models as a research collaboration, but then she really saw that clinically, we're really letting patients down. She treated hundreds of immigrant women at the Bridge Clinic in Tampa, Florida, where she saw, we're not doing right by these patients. We're not able to give them the level of personalized care they deserve And the software systems and services that Delphina will be building will be able to actually really help those patients with clinical understanding and clinical partnership. So to conclude, I just wanted to say, look for like-minded folks. You'll find them in your homes and maybe your brothers and sisters. You'll find them in your labs, compatriots in arms that you've been working alongside for a long time, maybe on a smaller project. But if you have, a new ambition, as we did with Hikma Health, we found so many folks that were along for some of them the entire journey. Adesh, who Professor Moraes will remember as he was an undergraduate with us. He eventually became our chief design officer at Hikma Health and has stayed with us to this day, where he continues to lead design efforts as well as participate in several research initiatives. So you'll find like-minded folks everywhere, and basically bringing them together in service of a more impact-oriented or product-oriented mission. To me, it's the most gratifying work that we do. And I just wanted to encourage you all to explore it, because actually, at the point at which you take the plunge, and like for me, not going to residency, or for Ali not, putting his job at Google, which is a very safe job, that's, that takes a certain level of commitment, and there might be no going back, is sometimes the reality. But while you're in lab, while you're in an environment that's supportive, if you have an idea, whether or not it pertains directly to the research work that you're doing, if it's pertaining to that work, great. Talk to your PI, maybe you can spin out a company, which is a very, very common approach for most folks that are in our situation. And if you have something that, like for Hikma Health, it had almost nothing to do with my academic research, but all of my academic advisors were very, very supportive. And to the point where by the time I was actually doing my med school rotations, Hikma Health had become a known quantity in some circles, in some digital health spaces, and some of the folks who followed entrepreneurship. So that was, that was a melding of the worlds in a way, because I used to in grad school just do my research work and then go home and do my Hikma Health work. But to see those worlds all come together, and to see Hikma Health making an impact where now if you just Google free and open source EHR, we're not the first result, but we're somewhere on the page. So I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to make impact through Hikma Health, the opportunity to scale my scientific work through, now entrepreneurial ventures like Delphina. And I'm really excited to just kick off a discussion with you all, see what your thoughts are, if you have any questions for me about my journey, or ideas that you all have that you might be interested in pursuing. Thank you.
Sana, thank you so very much. This was incredibly lightning. I mean, I would definitely say that the best thing about your presentation is that it's so down to earth. I mean, it's so real. It's so close to home. I mean, we actually have a lot of what you said and what you went through going on inside our own laboratories. So, well, since I have the chance of talking to you every time that I want to, I would really like to open the microphone to other students or the graduate course coordinator, or anybody else to make their questions.
Márcio, can I go first? Can you hear me?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
All right. Sinan, first of all, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. Yeah, your stance as a scientist and as a medical doctor is really commendable. My question for you here is, as you said, there's a gap between the progress we have in the labs and the technology that the end user actually has access to, right? Mm-hmm. And as I understand, this is mainly due to regulation. At some point, we need to have accountability, right? You cannot just design a software, an app that will estimate when the person is, I don't know, ovulating or, prone to have a seizure. And if anything goes wrong, I mean, we need to reduce this level of noise, and therefore you need regulation, and therefore the gold standard protocols are all in some way outdated, right, from the 80s or the 70s. And so I just wanted to understand in your company, for instance, what is the resistance, what is the path that you encounter when actually trying to implement these ideas for the end user?
Thanks, Professor Felipe. That's a very interesting question. And I think, this probably parallels a lot of if you all have thought about commercializing some of your work. So on the research side, like I know Professor Sergio Concalo is a neurosurgeon who's done some very interesting work on the basically implanting and getting very interesting signals from epilepsy patients. But to do that in a research context, which we've also done at MGH and other places, is very different from one day, let's say, closing the loop and having the algorithms that Professor Morais and I were building back in 2018. Marcio is okay, all right. The algorithms that we built, which you can see on GitHub, and other groups now around the world have built high performing algorithms, and it's really cool to see how seizure prediction as a space, from when we were going to conferences in 2015 and it was sort of like not really a hot space, it wasn't really working, to like 5 or 6 years later, where a lot of the big data approaches have been implemented. Oh, and there he is, Dr. Kankadu, the man of the hour.
Yeah.
Good to see you, sir. So I think the challenge, though, to your question, Professor Felipe, is that the regulatory body is extremely important, and we work with the FDA. We're submitting all of the work we do before it touches a single patient will go through the FDA, which the FDA notoriously has a very conservative bar. More so I think in the pharma space generally than the medical device space, but in general as a watchdog. But that's what I want, right? If I'm a patient, or if my wife were to be using the Delphina system when she was in labor, that would be, I would be happy that the FDA has that bar. So rising to meet that bar is a continual aspiration or challenge for our company. But I think there will always be a delta, and that's good, right? You want the leading edge of science to be at some pace from where you are clinically, but in some spaces, especially in obstetrics, it's just way too large of a lag. Like you said, 1970s, 1980s. Neuroscience, there's some spaces where we're closer, and a lot of the early, like Empatica, the Italian seizure detection company, kudos to them for really, very early on commercializing seizure detection technology. Seizure prediction technology is still a little ways off. And I think you'll see that for wearables like Empatica is a wrist wearable, the bar is a lot lower, right? They sort of are able to experiment and implement new algorithms much more easily than, for example, NeuroPace or other implantable devices that are actually direct neurostimulators. So I think that is logical, and that'll continue to be the case. But strategically, for when we were starting Delphina, we really had to factor that in. That one, there's a regulatory risk, which we're very upfront with our investors and the public and everyone about. That we will only put this in hospital labor and delivery rooms if it actually works. We're going to clinically validate it through a retrospective study, and that's and so I'd say in many ways we're actually aligned with the FDA that says, let's see the data. We're also like, let's all sit and review the data together. And I think having a scientific background is helpful for that, because if you look at a lot of other companies that come more from the commercial side and say, oh yeah, I'll build some product and then figure out the science, they're the ones that tend to get the letters from the FDA saying, hey, slow down. So I'm really optimistic actually that in the next wave of innovation, at least in the United States, I'm not as familiar with the regulatory environment in Brazil, that we'll be able to come up with innovations that close the gap closer to maybe 5 years rather than 30 years to the benefit of our patients.
All right, excellent.
Thanks, Professor Felipe. And I'd be curious to hear from anyone else who has worked in a regulated space, if experiences with the Brazilian equivalent of the FDA itself, or others in Europe or elsewhere. Just curious to hear anyone else's experiences to share as well. Or Dr. Kankadu, if you want to share at all about your work, and if you would see it being potentially commercializable by maybe an enterprising grad student out there, and how that process might work.
I was going to suggest that Sergio helps us out here, because there's a lot of what he's doing that I think it's quite in the verge of being quite useful for clinical practice.
Yeah, first of all, great presentation. It was amazing. Once again, it's nice to see you. But well, we have some. I think we need to analyze in a different perspective in a way. For devices in Brazil, especially implantable devices, for example, we have a really strict regulatory agency that will be, no way more cost to do this kind of things, and a little bit lazy in a way. But it's not so different from other countries. But the point is, much of the knowledge, it's already been clinically validated in lots of different situations, but it's really far away from the clinician, because nobody was paying attention to that and make an interface that is good to be used, or a device that could simple that concept that's already being validated in the clinical perspective. It happens a lot with depth electrodes, for example. You have many, packages for MATLAB and for other softwares that can be used, and they're already being validated in patients, but they are not available for the regular physician or neurosurgeon. So you need to be related to research, labs and things like that to have access to that. And I think that's a really great field. You don't have a really problem with regulatory agencies because it's already been validated. So you need to show the data, just build the interface and use things that are already being validated before. And this is not so difficult to do. The point is, I think in Brazil especially, we don't have the structure to make this way easy for the researchers, right? We don't have people that already know this path and say, oh, you just need to do that. You need to submit that form in that situation. So we need to do everything from the beginning. So it takes time. And I think that's the main problem. But when you're talking about patients, for example, we can do lots of things and lots of different analysis using the same electrode that is used in clinical practice. You don't need to use a different electrode. So it's already available. Of course, we have new electrodes now for, microarrays and everything that's, being built up. But you can do lots of things. And we used to do this on research basis, but they are not available to the clinical, field in a way, because you don't have the interface, you don't have the device, things that are really simple to make. So I think this is the main point now at this point. Of course, if you're doing something that is really disruptive and a really new concept, it will take time and cannot be different now. But like you said, Senna, it's really difficult to make it faster than it used to be. In our case, for example, we have patients with epilepsy. We do these depth electrodes implantations for, in a way to analyze the probable epileptic zone. We register the signal and we use these patients to do another protocol that it's non-invasive, don't have many other, risks for the patient. And we try to extract most of it, using different analysis. And that's really interesting because you don't do nothing else than you're going to do in clinic. You're just using better the data. So I think that's one thing. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if it helped a lot, but
yeah, that is helpful. And I think what's interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot because you're actively practicing, is that sometimes the biggest demand, like you mentioned building these algorithms. And if you were to tell a patient that, like, yes, we have an algorithm in the lab that can, let's say, detect seizures at 99.9% AUC, or, predict seizures at 95%. And a lot of the demand, and we've actually seen this in the literature where people have pulled patients, and like patients are sometimes the most progressive. And I would say sometimes unfortunate when you have like the questionable approvals that happen, like recently with the new Alzheimer's biologic from Biogen, where, patients are actually, patient advocacy groups are really pushing for it. They see some hope, they see some possibility there. But, the professional groups are sometimes the ones that have the skepticism grounded in science. So I think it's a balance. And I think when you build, you're right, I think there's no new risk to the patient to obtain to create the algorithms. But when you're going to try to close the loop and I think, the regulatory bodies are just starting to figure this out. They're just starting to put out guidance on what is it like to apply, a regulatory framework that was really developed for pharmacology in the 1950s and did a really good job, keeping thalidomide out. But how does that apply to the AI machine learning software as a medical device space? So they're figuring it out. And I think, to the credit of a lot of, I think for us coming in the more physiology time series data space, there's very limited precedent. And there's, maybe a few cardiology companies that have obtained approval for their algorithms that can basically detect cardiac events remotely or, without physician intervention. But radiology and pathology, the computer vision based spaces are much more rich in terms of companies that have gone before us. And informally, a lot of them have been very helpful to us and just like mentoring and advising us. And I think what could be great to see is maybe a more formal group of entrepreneurs who want to do this the right way, right? We actually want to work with the FDA, but we don't want to get mired down in bureaucracy. We don't want to make tactical mistakes by doing the wrong approach first. We want to say, all right, we want to do this right. We respect the watchdog, and we want to make sure that we get that regulatory approval so we can reach patients faster. Can we all learn from each other? Can we all work within the system to do better together. So I think personally, when I hear that a regulatory body is strict, like from an entrepreneur standpoint, of course, every entrepreneur is like, oh, it's so annoying, it's going to slow me down. But as a patient myself, right, I would be glad that, okay, when I hear the Brazilian body is relatively strict, probably slows down innovation a good bit, but it makes sure that every device that eventually goes in the brain of a Brazilian patient with epilepsy, we know that it's going to be relatively safe. Thanks for that, Dr. Concado. Happy to take. Yeah, go ahead.
I just really fast remark, but when you talk about like radiology, for example, and in the use of algorithms to actually analyze clinical data, SPM8, SPM9, I mean, these statistical parametric imaging packages, they are available. I mean, they're for free, and clinicians do use them. And I think that's a very good starting point. If I understood what Sergio was saying, the whole idea is we don't have to develop the electrode itself. I mean, we can buy those, but we can develop a new way to use, analyze, or to extract useful information from data that can actually help clinicians with their diagnosis. So I think that's a very good starting point. And I would definitely say that it would be interesting to evolve to a point where we do build our own MRI machines, where we do build our own electroencephalograms, electrocardiograms, and we do build a very nicely integrated system in which the device that captures the information is also the device that analyzes it. But then again, I still think that this is the starting point in which you have a very good domain of the science. You have a very good domain of what the data means and how it can be useful. I think that allows for a new way of actually working together with the watchdog, which, by the way, I think it's extremely necessary. And I think that's exactly why governments are set in place. So you work together with it and not against it. I mean, there is a certain logic to the point in which you do not allow anything or any crazy or fake idea or non-science-based idea to actually be used as a treatment. And I'll definitely say that it's interesting that these kinds of products can come from a scientific mind. So I just want to point out that while all this was happening to you, I mean, you were building the company and all that, you still wrote a paper on the reduction of COVID incidents in non-pharmacologic interventions. What I mean to say is you saw a point where you could analyze data and publish it, and that would be of a great help to people to say, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. This kind of public approach makes a difference. So I would definitely say that this is important. I think this is a very good starting point for companies or startups to begin.
For sure, and I would just say that that project that Professor Morais is mentioning, that came out of like a few of us med students just talking one day, and then we decided, we were hitting up the the county association that is supposed to basically do what we did, the government body that's supposed to put out data about how COVID is going in different counties and what is being done about it policy-wise. And they were sort of like, yeah, okay, we're working on it. So we said, you know what, we'll just get an army of volunteers. We got 104 volunteer medical students and graduate students, and from all kinds of different universities across the country. We had folks from Native American reservations, and we sought to understand what is actually happening in the policy space, and we structured it into a data set, and we just put it out there. And it's been really rewarding. I mean, we wrote our small paper on it, but what's been more rewarding is to see everyone else out there, excuse me, not just from the United States. Actually, one of the first people who worked on GitHub was from Brazil. And, people using it to see parallels in their own countries to think about what kind of local policies should be instituted. So I think, when you think about projects that you can do, if, quitting your job or not going to residency or not getting the professorship and going on this entrepreneurial path sounds like maybe it's not right now, I would say if you take anything from this talk, just take the fact that if you just pursue something, if there's an idea you have that you'd like to explore, go for it, right? You have very supportive faculty that you see here that are bringing people like me who left the system to come and share with you my story. So when you can get folks like that on your side, and I've found many folks, not just within the neuroscience space, but in the public health space in particular, who are very excited, especially if you're doing something free and open source that, you know, maybe their research group or their lab can use one day as a resource. They'll be very supportive, both potentially financially and personally with their mentorship and scientifically with their advice and guidance. So if you have an idea out there, especially in, you know, as the country, as Brazil is still wrestling, as we mentioned, with the COVID crisis, and, you know, we're all here thinking of you all, but, you know, you all as students, as graduate students, are some of the most highly educated folks in your country who have, you know, don't necessarily have the money to do something. You may not have, you know, a team yet to work for you, but you have ideas and you have technical know-how and you have technical resources. So if you can think of a way to contribute to your country's COVID response, in, you know, as the government has kind of, at least the federal government has kind of abdicated responsibility and leadership for it, you can make a big difference. I'll just share with you briefly, the best COVID prediction models in the world were built by some 26-year-old guy named Youyang Gu, who quit his job. And, you know, he had been, I think, a data scientist or a software engineer for some Silicon Valley company. And his predictions beat ours. They beat the University of Washington and Columbia and Harvard and all the top epidemiology places on earth. So, and there was actually an article about him eventually in the New York Times, which we were really happy to see. But it just says what one person can do, right? With the power of a great idea and, you know, with the appropriate scientific and technical know-how, then the right execution, you can actually make a huge impact, even on a sort of side project for 6 months.
I just brought up this paper just to show that it's a two-way street. I mean, you can actually go from science to, I mean, with the philosophy of being an entrepreneur, you can go and actually build your own company, but you can use that same entrepreneur philosophy, idea, the challenge to do something different and actually make a difference and write a paper. You can go back to science. You can go back to science with that philosophy, gather people, gather expertise, and go in a joint effort to show something that is kind of obvious, that you can reduce the incidence of COVID by using non-pharmacological interventions. I mean, it's although it's common sense, now you frame this as a scientific work. So I think this philosophy actually works both ways. Perhaps these two worlds are not as separated as they should be. Perhaps some sort of risk assessment or risk challenging posture is necessary within academia and scientists, and perhaps we have not, I don't know, we have thought of this place as a safe zone, and perhaps this has not done well for science and academia.
I think the good news, though, is that it's changing. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, that at universities like Harvard, they're starting to realize that the incentives are misaligned. And I think at some other leading American universities like Stanford, they already realized this a long time ago, that you don't get academically promoted. You don't get a professorship for taking big swings at things that are commercially applicable. You don't get, if you don't publish in the top journals, you don't get the big grants. So your incentives are sort of one-to-one to kind of sometimes play it safer. So I think, like you were just saying, Marcio, we absolutely need to incentivize people within academia to start exploring big ideas, big questions that maybe are not, the most foundational scientifically, but are going to actually make real impact on people's lives. And actually, the NIH has already started doing this through various grant programs where they help academic labs commercialize their technologies. So the good news, I think, is that things are moving in the right direction.
Felipe, anybody? I mean, we are getting really, it's noon, and I know that people have planned lunch. And I can see that perhaps Sergio is already going inside the operating room right now. So we don't want to leave his patient with his head open for too long. So Senan, thank you so very much for doing this. This is important for our graduate course. It's completely non-orthodox. I mean, what I mean to say is we usually expect in seminars figures, graphs, different statistical differences between curves. And what you showed us here was, I know that you know how to do that because I saw your PhD thesis defense, but what we saw here was a change in paradigm, a nicely put different way to look at the reasons why we do what we do. And I would like to thank you very much for bringing this to our attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much all for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my story with you all, and really look forward to hopefully seeing you all one day at a churrasco at a fazenda near you.
So no,
Right,
thank you very much. Just before we leave, one last question, a single sentence reply. Suppose a postgraduate student wants to start, his own company or being an entrepreneur. Should he or she first focus on a problem that he or she considers important, a problem that the world considers it important, or should she or he just start studying computer science and start coding things?
I think start with what you know. And I know a lot of folks that have made outsized impact as the chief scientific officer of a company that is quite technical and they don't know how to push a line of code, but they are a great biologist. And I know people who are leading great companies in the sciences who don't even have a scientific background. So I think the coding thing it's obviously a great skill, and I'm really grateful that I learned it. But I would say you hit the nail on the head with the first option. You got to start at home. You got to start with what's important to you and what you're passionate about, because that's what's going to get you up at 3 a.m. To get it done. And eventually, if you're solving a real problem for the world, your company will take off.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Sandan, again. That
Thanks,
was
Professor.
very insightful. All right.
Such a pleasure. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye. So I'm going to just finish the meeting here. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.